I'm 63 years old, and I still take the same bus home from the hospital every night, not because I have to, because I never learned how to stop. My husband passed 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctor said was fast, and I suppose he meant it kindly, but fast doesn't feel like a mercy when you're the one watching. After the funeral, after my daughter flew back to Vancouver and my son-in-law shook my hand at the airport like I was a business associate he'd just concluded negotiations with, I went back to work. I'm a health records coordinator at a mid-sized hospital in Hamilton, Ontario, night shift, 11 to 7. I took the nights because no one else wanted them, and also because sleeping had become something that happened to other people. The route home is simple. 2 buses, 40 minutes, 1 transfer at King and James. Most mornings, the city is just waking up. The coffee shops are pulling their chairs off the tables. The Tim Hortons on the corner is already a lineup out the door. I carry a thermos of red rose tea that I make before my shift ends, and I walk to the stop and I wait, and that's my life. That's been my life. I noticed him about 3 weeks into my new schedule. The security desk at the hospital's east entrance is staffed overnight by a rotating team, but there was one man who worked the same nights I did, Tuesday through Saturday, always there when I badged out at 5 minutes past 7. He was maybe 65, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had clearly been handsome once and had settled into something more interesting with age. He had a white beard. He kept very neat. He always had a crossword folded into quarters on the desk beside him, and he always stood when someone passed through his checkpoint, even at 7 in the morning, even after a full overnight shift, even when the person passing through was just me. The first time he said good morning, I almost didn't answer. I wasn't being rude. I'd just gotten out of the habit of being spoken to. "Good morning," he said. "You're the records lady." "I suppose I am," I said. "You always leave at 7:05, he said. "On the dot." I set my crossword down by it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said good morning and kept walking. But I thought about it on the bus. Someone had noticed my schedule. Someone had noticed me. His name was Harold. No, wait. His name was Stuart. I learned it 2 weeks later when I finally stopped and asked. Stuart Okafor. His father had come to Toronto from Lagos in the late 70s, he told me, and his mother was from Sudbury. And he had ended up in Hamilton the way a lot of people ended up in Hamilton, which was gradually, and then, all at once. I started bringing 2 cups. It wasn't a plan. I made my thermos before my shift ended, and one Tuesday morning, I just made it bigger. I brought a second cup, one of those insulated paper ones from the break room, and I poured it before I left and carried it to the east exit and set it on his desk without saying much of anything. He looked at it. He looked at me. "Red rose?" he said. "Is there anything else?" I said. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that takes over a person's whole face without them seeming to notice. "My grandmother drank red rose," he said, "every morning, before anything else." "Mine too," I said. That was all. I signed out and walked to the bus, but the next Tuesday I brought 2 cups again and the Tuesday after that, and somewhere in there it became a thing we did, a ritual. I'd set the cup on his desk. He'd say something about the crossword, about the weather, about whatever was on the overnight news, and I'd catch my bus. 8 minutes, maybe 10, nothing more than that. It sounds like very little. In that period of my life, it was not very little. My daughter called every Sunday. She meant well. She'd ask how I was eating, whether I'd called the grief counselor she'd found, whether I'd thought about joining one of those widow groups at the community center. I told her I was fine. I was eating. I hadn't called the counselor. I hadn't joined anything. What I didn't tell her was that the 10 minutes at the east exit on Tuesday mornings had become the part of my week I looked forward to most, which I understood was a strange thing to admit about a conversation with a security guard I barely knew. Stuart told me he had a son in Guelph, They'd had a falling out a few years back, something about money and the estate after his own mother passed, and they hadn't spoken properly since. He said it the way people say things they've made a kind of peace with, matter-of-factly, like reading a weather report for a city you used to live in. Still, I noticed he always paused after he said his son's name, just for a second, like there was something behind it he wasn't ready to say out loud. I didn't push. You don't. When someone gives you that pause, you just drink your tea and let it sit. This went on for about 5 months, Tuesdays through Saturdays, 7 in the morning, 10 minutes at the East Desk. Somewhere in the 4th month, I started to think of him as not a friend, exactly. Something more specific than that. Someone who was part of the shape of my days. Someone whose absence I would have noticed. Which is why, on the Thursday morning in late February, when I came through the east exit and found a different guard at the desk, a young woman I didn't recognize, very professional, very pleasant, I felt something drop in my stomach. "Where's Stewart?" I said. She told me he'd taken a few days of personal leave, nothing to worry about. She said it the way people say things when they don't actually know whether there's something to worry about. I said thank you and caught my bus, but I held my extra cup all the way to King and James and then threw it away at the transfer stop because I didn't know what else to do with it. He was back the following Tuesday. He looked tired in a way that was different from shift tired. His crossword was still folded into quarters, but he hadn't touched it. When I set the cup on his desk, he looked up, and something moved across his face that I couldn't name. "Everything all right?" I said. He nodded. Then he said, "Edith, can I ask you something strange?" That was my name, Edith. Edith Calloway. I don't think he'd ever used it before. "You can ask," I said. "Do you know a man named Victor?" And then he said a last name I recognized. I felt the floor shift under me, just slightly, not a dramatic feeling. More like when you step off a curb in the dark and it's a half-inch lower than you expected. I did know that name. Not well, but I knew it. There was a man in my building, the apartment complex I'd moved into after selling the house. 8 floors, mostly retirees and young professionals. The kind of building where you nod at people in the elevator but don't know their names. There was a man on my floor who I'd seen in the hallway a handful of times. Quiet. Maybe 70. He'd smiled at me once when we were both waiting for the elevator, and I'd smiled back, and that was all. "Why?" I said. Stewart hesitated. "I've seen him outside the hospital," he said. "Twice now, sitting in a car in the visitor lot, not visiting, just sitting, for hours." He paused. "I ran the plates through the system. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I did. And when I looked up the name, I found something." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a printed page, looked like a property record. I work in health records, not legal, but I know how to read a document. The property listed was in my building. The owner's name was the man from the elevator. "I don't understand," I said. "His previous address," Stewart said, and pointed to a line on the page. I looked at it. It was the address of the house I had sold 8 months ago, the house my husband and I had lived in for 26 years. I sat down in the chair across from his desk. I don't usually sit. I had a bus to catch, but I sat down. "He lived on your street?" I said. "Not lived," Stewart said. "He listed it as a correspondence address for a numbered company. For about 2 years. I stared at the paper. I thought about the man in the elevator, his smile, how he'd seemed to be waiting for me to speak first. How, now that I thought about it, he was always in the hallway when I came home from the bus, not every day, but often. "He knows my schedule," I said. It wasn't a question. Stewart nodded. "I think he's been watching you for a while," he said. I don't know why, but I didn't want to say nothing. "You bring me tea every morning, Edith. The least I can do is tell you when something doesn't feel right." I drove myself home that morning. I called a cab, which I almost never do, because I didn't want to wait at an open bus stop. I went up the back stairwell instead of the elevator. I deadbolted my door and stood in my kitchen and tried to think clearly. I called my daughter that afternoon instead of waiting for Sunday. I told her what Stuart had told me. She was quiet for a long time, which is not like her, and then she said, "Mum, I need you to call the police." I did. I called the non-emergency line and spoke to someone who was professional and not particularly concerned, and who told me to document any incidents and call back if I had something more specific. I understood their position. I didn't have much: a man who sat in a parking lot, a man who smiled at me in an elevator, a piece of paper with an old address on it. But I had Stuart, and Stuart, it turned out, had been paying attention for longer than I knew. Over the next 2 weeks, he documented everything quietly. Timestamps, photos taken on his personal phone from inside the lobby, capturing the same sedan in the visitor lot on 6 separate occasions. He found out, through channels I didn't ask about, that the numbered company tied to my old address had been named in a civil complaint 3 years earlier, something involving fraudulent liens placed on estates, senior women who'd recently lost spouses, properties held in a kind of legal limbo while the paperwork was being contested. When I understood what I was reading, I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with February. My husband had left me the house and a modest RSP and a small insurance payout, nothing extravagant, but enough. Enough to be worth targeting, apparently, if you were patient and organized and willing to wait for a recently widowed woman to sell her home and move somewhere smaller and more isolated and easier to watch. I gave everything Stuart had gathered to a lawyer, not the non-emergency line this time, a lawyer, and then the police, and this time I had documentation, real documentation, the kind that makes people sit up straight. It took 3 months. I'm not going to make it sound fast or tidy because it wasn't. There were 2 interviews at the station. There was a period of about 6 weeks when I changed my shifts, came and went at irregular hours, took different routes. My daughter flew in from Vancouver and stayed for 10 days, sleeping on my pull-out couch, making pasta at midnight and not mentioning the grief counselor once. The man from the elevator was questioned. His numbered company was investigated. I don't know the full outcome, and my lawyer told me I might never know everything, because some of it was civil, and some of it was a matter of other complaints being filed by other women in other buildings. What I do know is that he vacated his apartment in my building before spring, and I haven't seen his car in the visitor lot since. The morning after my daughter flew home, I came through the east exit at 7:05, and Stuart was at his desk with his crossword folded into quarters, and he stood up when I came through, same as always. I set the cup on his desk and didn't say anything for a moment. "I don't know how to thank you," I said finally. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You could have said nothing," I said. "It wasn't your job." He looked at me for a moment. "My grandmother used to say that looking after people is everyone's job," he said. "She said it's the only job that matters, really. The rest is just how you fill in the hours." I thought about that on the bus. I thought about it for a long time after. I still take the same route, Tuesday through Saturday, 7 in the morning, 40 minutes, 1 transfer at King and James. I still make my thermos before my shift ends. I still bring 2 cups. But something changed in the spring. One Tuesday, Stuart mentioned offhand that his son had called. They'd talked for almost an hour. He said it the way you say something you're still a little afraid to believe. Carefully. Like if you hold it too tight, it might not be real. I didn't make a big thing of it. I just said I was glad. And I was. I've thought a lot about what would have happened if I'd never stopped. If I'd kept walking past that desk every morning the way I walked past everything in those first months after my husband died, head down, thermos in hand, present in body and nowhere else. I can't quite bring myself to think it all the way through. Some things you're better off not finishing. What I know is this: kindness isn't a performance. It's not something you do because you expect something back. It's something you do because you're paying attention, and paying attention is the only way you stay connected to the world when the world has given you reasons to stop. I almost stopped. I very nearly let the grief close me off completely and walk past every person and every small moment and every chance to be something more than just a woman going home on the bus. I'm glad I made the thermos bigger. I'm glad I stopped and asked his name. I'm glad every single morning that I brought 2 cups. I think about that thermos a lot. Not in a sentimental way, exactly. More the way you think about a small decision that turned out to matter more than you knew when you made it. I was exhausted and grieving, and I made the thermos bigger. That's all it was, and somehow that was enough. What I've come to understand is that things connect. Not in a mysterious way, in a plain, ordinary way that we tend to overlook because we're moving too fast or too deep inside our own pain to notice. Stuart noticed my schedule before I noticed his. He paid attention when it cost him nothing, and then he kept paying attention when it would have been much easier to say nothing, to let it be someone else's problem, to keep his head down and finish his crossword and clock out at 7:30. He didn't do that, and the reason he didn't, I believe this fully, is because someone had been decent to him first. Not life-changing decent. Just 2 cups of tea and a few minutes of conversation and the basic human acknowledgement that he was worth talking to. That's the whole chain. That's all of it. I spent a long time after my husband died feeling like the world had become very small and very indifferent, and maybe it had, or maybe I had. When you're that deep in grief, it's hard to tell the difference between the world pulling away and you pulling away from it. What I know is that the moment I stopped walking past Stuart's desk without looking up was the moment something started to shift. Not dramatically, just a cup of tea, a name, 8 minutes on a Tuesday morning. Enough to remind me that I was still here and still connected to something. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this, if they're going through something similar. Not a lesson, exactly. More an observation. The people who come through hard things aren't necessarily tougher than the rest of us. They're just the ones who kept showing up. To their own life, to the people immediately around them, even when showing up felt like it cost more than they had. There's a kind of quiet integrity in that. In doing the decent thing when you're tired. In asking someone's name when you don't have to. In not letting your own pain become a reason to stop seeing other people. And then there's what Stuart did, taking what he'd noticed and doing something careful and considered with it, rather than panicking or ignoring it. He didn't rush. He documented. He thought it through. He came to me with a piece of paper instead of a theory. That kind of clear-headedness, that willingness to use your mind carefully even when the situation is unsettling, I don't think that comes from nowhere. I think it comes from having lived with some dignity, from having practiced being thoughtful in small moments long before the big ones arrive. What carried me through the months that followed wasn't courage in any dramatic sense. It was just the decision, made over and over, to keep going, to change my route and not let it break me, to call my daughter and ask for help without apologizing for needing it, to walk back through that east exit every Tuesday morning and set the cup on the desk and keep being a person in the world, even when part of me would have preferred to disappear into the apartment and stay there. I'm still here. Stuart and his son are talking again. My daughter calls on Sundays. I still make the thermos bigger than I need to, probably always will.